Hey, it's June 19th, 2024. Happy Juneteenth. This is Neil, and I am working on Cloudflare workers, and I found a problem with Brotli compression, which I've encountered in the past. And instead of just trying to hack it up, I dug a little deeper. So the main Surfey page is supposed to look like this, and I actually use a worker to insert some JavaScript, which allows me to modify the page. However, running the worker lately has done this for the last month-ish. So I just have been developing by deploying to production, which is not a good way to do it. So as I'm trying to figure out bugs, such as this one, where the copyright appears in the upper left, I wasn't able to do it on dev. So long story short, before we dive into it, I set the compatibility date in my Wrangler TOML file to the current date. And now if I refresh, everything works correctly. So from here on, I'm just going to go and explain more about why that is. So the way that this page works is when I get a request, I go and do a fetch against the ConvertKit creator profile. And that's where I get the content, which also has a custom domain attached to it. And that's what allows me to keep the URLs all the same. Now, if we look at my fetch, it's as simple as doing this, await fetch with the URL, and the URL is modified to pull that from the ConvertKit host. But what was strange is my handler, which uses HTMLRewriter, none of this was working. And so after diving down deeper, I found the old problem that my .text, or rather the response body that was coming back, wasn't being decoded. It was coming back as gibberish. And looking at the headers, I found that the content encoding was BR for Brotli. And so that led me down a journey this morning to uncover the problems, and I eventually found my way back to the Cloudflare reference documentation for fetch. And sure enough, one of the first things it talks about is the accept encoding header. And I thought, well, I don't want to have to say gzip. I did experiment with that, and I was able to get it to not respond with Brotli by responding with gzip. However, that just having to add code felt wrong. It didn't seem like the correct thing to be doing. So I dug down deeper and found that Brotli encoding should be handled automatically. And that was the default as of 429. So that corresponds with the change, right? Where I wasn't able to try this on dev. And you can explicitly enable or disable it by putting these into your wrangler.toml, or you can set your toml file compatibility date to be later than this. So I just set it to today, and then that works. But what's funny is compatibility, the way the compatibility stuff works is it's supposed to prevent breaking changes so that when you create your worker on a specific date, it will continue to last based on how workers reacted back on that date. But this comes back to the problem with all modern development, which is, yes, the worker runtime was version locked to that date. However, other things that the worker uses, external resources, do not get locked to that date. And so the change here was that Brotli encoding compatibility for automatically decompressing Brotli, so you could use .text and .json inside your worker, was added later. And it wasn't there previously, but once it was added, then they started returning Brotli stuff from the cache, because fetch uses the Cloudflare cache. And because it was returning Brotli now, by default, the inability to decode Brotli, which is part of the previous compatibility setting, now became an issue. So it's kind of funny the way this stuff works. It's, yeah, you can lock your code to a specific point in time, but you can't lock all the other services that it utilizes to that point in time. So we could continue to use the old worker. I could keep this at January. But in order to do that, I'd also have to modify how I handle the request and clone the response so that there's new request headers. So I'd say something like new request equals request, new request, request URL, and then in here, method, request, method, headers, new request headers. And then for this, we'd say new request headers equals new headers, request headers, new request headers, set content, accept encoding gzip. And there's a bunch of other properties here, but let's just try this. Wrong page. And there you have it. So that's another way to work around it. If you don't want to have to update your compatibility date in the worker, but you don't want it to return Brotli, you can simply override that or encourage the Cloudflare cache to use gzip rather than Brotli. And there's other properties in the request object. So actually cloning a request object with slight changes to it in Cloudflare workers is rather difficult because they're immutable and you have to specify all the properties. But that's one way you can do it if you don't want to update your compatibility date. But for me, that seems like the best way to go because, again, even if you try to lock your code to an old compatibility date, you can't control all the external resources that your code is connecting to. And so this is what forces you to keep your code continually up to date with the rest of the ecosystem. A necessary but unfortunate side effect of ceding our control and programming to all these external services. All right, that's Neil. Happy holiday, and I'll talk to you later.